Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm Dr. Heather Hatch, and these are our MOA Live Talk series. So today we're going to be talking about Privy Archaeology, or, as I have it subtitled in my notes, the crappiest archaeology. So I've talked about privies a little bit in some of my other talks, but I thought I would take sort of a deep dive into the muck of it. I'll try and keep the puns to a minimum, but no promises. So privies are neat for a number of reasons, and they can really help us understand the history and use of a site over time, and get a lot of details about their inhabitants. We tend to find them on what we call industrial era sites, or they're more commonly associated with historical archaeology. So, first things first, what is a privy? So a privy is an outdoor structure with seating intended for the elimination of human waste. So defecation and urination, or for being more informal, pooping and peeing. Basically, it's an outhouse or an outdoor toilet. So as you can guess, the name privy is related to the word private, with the idea that this is a space to go and do your private business, right? So a privy then has several elements. It's external to the house, so it's outside. It has a pit or a vault to hold the refuse, so it's got like that's usually dug into the ground. So it's not like a porta potty today where it's a separate element that's part of like an overall superstructure. It does have a structure enclosing it, so it's not open air like a latrine. It has seating, so it has somewhere for you to sit. So probably what comes to mind for a lot of people when we're talking about these sorts of things is your sort of classic outhouse. So you have a single seat wooden shack out behind the house. So if you're getting like a real cartoon classic, it might have like a little moon cut into the door. But that's really just one style of them. They could have multiple seats or even multiple rooms for them. They could have unlined pits, but the vaults were commonly lined with things like wood or brick or stone, and that's to help keep the waste from seeping out into the ground around them. So it's kind of a sanitary improvement. So they could be pretty shallow, like just a couple of feet deep, and they could be quite deep, like 6-7 feet deep or even deeper. So there's a lot of variety, and like many things, they change over time. They change like based on different locations, what kinds of materials are available to build with, and all these different kinds of factors. So lots of different ways to build a privy. So then, what do we find archaeologically when we're looking at them? So privies are a kind of feature. They're sort of an evidence of human activity, a universal human activity even, but they're not really portable. So they're not like an artifact that we can recover and take out of the field with us. So we consider them to be a feature. We can recognize them based on their structures. If there's anything standing, or for example, the way that the vaults are constructed, we can recognize them that way, but also by their contents. So the human waste leaves a particularly kind of recognizable, sometimes still kind of aromatic soil as it breaks down. So I have not personally ever had the pleasure of excavating in a privy, but my understanding from sources who have been in the field is that it can be pretty gross still. And depending on what's been found, it can actually require you to have to use PPE, so personal protective equipment like gloves and masks and even like a full hazmat suit, sort of depending on what the condition is that you're finding this, how well preserved that organic material still is. So that's to protect the archaeologists who are doing the work. And so that can be in the field, but again, depending on what you're doing, like it can be extended to processing recovered soil samples, for example, and even sometimes cleaning artifacts in a lab if they're particularly gross. Not always though. Sometimes it's just kind of like a really rich, dark, well-composted soil and it's fine. Other times it's a little bit more disgusting. So then what is it about privies that make them so archaeologically interesting, despite how gross they were, both conceptually, you're digging in somebody's bathroom, and then also, you know, as I was saying, sometimes still. So there's really a lot of things. They really, they encapsulate a lot of the facets of past human life in a really unique way. So people have always been people, and one thing that people do and have pretty much done always forever is toss stuff in holes. So a privy is really just a big, deep, gross hole. It's perfect for getting rid of all kinds of trash. So it isn't just human waste that they contain. So if you even just think about all the things that people try and flush down toilets today, even though they're really not designed for it. So I actually did some quick Googling just to sort of get an idea of some of the things that more modern plumbers have found in toilets that are really not meant to be tried or attempted to be flushed. There were some great things like Civil War era cannonball, various articles of clothing, miniature liquor bottles flushed down somebody's work toilet, jewelry, false teeth, toys, phones, people's cell phones falling out of their pockets into the toilet, kind of an unfortunate facet of modern life. Also various animals, and also money. So let me tell you though that things have really not changed that much. So in privies, these kinds of things and other objects were not as uncommon. So these stories today are kind of exceptional. That's much less the case when you're looking at the things that people have ever dumped in privies. Despite the fact that there were often bylaws, like in the cities especially, that intending to regulate what you could and couldn't toss into a privy, and also how full they were allowed to get. So like other kinds of features, privies can have stratigraphy. So that's layering that relates to specific periods of use. And this can tell us again about how they were used. So you can imagine that people were leaving their individual deposits in privy. So how do we see layers of that? Kind of, again, some gross concepts here to think about. But we can see it in certain ways. So one thing we can see it in is artifacts, which I'm going to get into in more detail later. But sometimes artifacts that we get in privies come from like a single deposit. So people dumping a bunch of metaphorical crap all at once, which can happen for a number of different reasons. And people have studied why they might find these kinds of deposits together. So sometimes there's things like people cleaning house, like spring cleaning, people moving out. So sometimes when a new family was moving in, they might find things that had been left behind and they just take it all and dump it in the privy. Sometimes if there was a death in the family, there's been records where, for example, where a new head of the household has come in and sort of gotten rid of everything else that the person who was previously in charge had collected. So just this stuff all gets sort of just dumped in the toilet. Sometimes privies also get used to dump ash from fireplaces, and so sometimes you get that sort of layer that would help sort of distinguish what comes before and after. And sometimes, you know, people would try and like cut down the smell or clean them out and so forth, which helps. Again, you can get evidence of where, you know, they might not have been completely cleaned out. You'll see that those layers when you're clearing them, and you can record sort of the different stratigraphy that way. It's also, once a privy was no longer in use for its original purpose, they were often capped because they were, again, gross. They would put something over top of those deposits just to sort of seal them in. And sometimes they were also completely emptied, sometimes for use and sometimes just because they did get gross. But they continue to be a good place to dump stuff, right? So there are still holes. People still like to dump things in holes, and then you have this place that was already sort of associated with garbage and waste, and so a lot of the times once they had finished being used as a privy, people would just continue to use that spot to dump other household trash, and so that could also build up in identifiable cultural layers, interspersed with soil and other things that are being blown or washed into that pit. And that's especially true, you can sort of see that cultural layering, like if the structure for the privy has been knocked down and into that pit as well. So that is something that we also sometimes encounter archaeologically. But even sort of just the location of privies can be archaeologically interesting. So we know that they were necessary, but also smelly, right? Gross. So they might have been convenient to locate them close to a house. That's not always what they're found, because people didn't want to be associated with those gross smells. So there was sort of an idea in the 19th century especially that these bad smells or odors or miasmas could be actually the cause of disease. So they didn't want to keep them right close to the house. So when you're talking about privy location, there's some of these ideas about sanitation that sort of go into where they might be found. Also, when you're talking about privies for shared housing, like townhouses, for example, then you start to get some interesting things going on with the placement of where they're located. There's also the construction of new privies over time, if they get really full, or if they get just really in disrepair. Sometimes they would just get capped and a new one dug. So you can sort of see how they change locations over time and how that land gets filled in, how it gets reused, and so forth. And their location and eventual discontinuation can tell us about changing beliefs and attitudes towards sanitation again, as well as access to new technologies and, to new infrastructure. So when you look at that comparatively in a city, it can really help construct a rich picture of life at the time. So you're looking at how things are changing in different neighborhoods, for example, can give you just an example of sort of the different affluence levels, different cultural things are going on in different parts of the city, just by, how people are using their bathrooms. So of course, when it comes down to the sort of the privies, one of the really interesting sorts of things that we find are in them, not just about where they're located, but what we find inside them as well. So artifacts from privies, because they do have a very tight use, they don't have to be used for a very, very long time, they can give us very precise dates. So the artifacts that we find them, again, because they're these industrial produced materials that we often have records about, when specific ceramic styles were being manufactured and sold, we can get those dates for those privies pretty concisely. And that can help us understand not only the use of the privy, but in putting together the story of the site overall. And because privies can be very artifact rich, despite the fact, again, that it was often illegal to use them for non-human waste, looking at the artifacts can give us insight into how, into the lives of the people who are using them, and more broadly, who are using the associated structures as well. So in my talk about the archaeology of Victoria Park here in London, one of the things I mentioned was that they found different sets of privies, so ones that were associated with the officers, and then also ones that were associated with the enlisted men. And you could really see just in the privy deposits some of the differences that really highlighted the status differences between those two sets of people in the same area even. So that's just one example. I also asked, when I was preparing for this talk, I reached out to some friends and contacts who are in the industry here in Ontario about some cool examples and neat finds from privies that they've encountered. And one of the ones I was given from a friend of mine who works at Stantec was that it was an old oval-shaped wooden horse brush with a broken leather strap that had been very clearly well used before it was tossed. So maybe it was finally tossed into the privy, once the strap was finally broken beyond repair. The bristles of the brush were really worn down, so again, it had been quite a long use life. But they actually still had horse hairs that were trapped in them. So that's kind of a neat, for her it was kind of a neat find. So the privy it came from also produced a number of other horse-related artifacts, and because of this, they were able to conclude that it was probably associated with a stable or a carriage house, or some other area where horses were being looked after. So the nature of the deposits, the organic, the human waste, the night soils as they're often called, means that there can be really good preservation of organic materials. Things like wood and leather and hair, as well as cloth and bone and so forth. They don't decay as quickly necessarily in these kinds of environments. So we can find things that don't necessarily survive in other kinds of contexts, like, for example, the brush that my friend described. One of the other kinds of objects that's actually found commonly in privies is chamber pots. So these would have been used inside the house, often at night or some other times where you might not want to leave the house to go out to the privy to do your business. So then generally the privy would be where these were then emptied, right? And so it's easy to imagine that some of them might get accidentally dropped. You're trying to empty it out carefully into the hole of the privy and you might slip and drop it. And, the bearer might wisely decide, I'm not going to go after that. So deciding against retrieval. Sometimes it does look like they might have been purposefully discarded. One of the finds I heard about when I was talking to some people from ASI was about a covered chamber pot that had been very deliberately and very carefully placed. So there's probably a very distressing story around why that particular chamber pot got disposed of how it did. But chamber pots, like, again, they're something that we find in privies. It might just be partly because they are very thickly, heavily built ceramics generally, so it might just be a matter in part of durability. But I think also that relationship it does account to some extent for why they get discarded and end up in those privies. So some of the other examples of things that people gave me when I asked were also pretty cool. So folks at ASI in general are big privy fans, and the company has worked on a number of large-scale urban industrial sites in Toronto with some really fascinating and kind of fun privy finds. So the favorite one that they gave me, or told me about, was probably from the work that they did on the Toronto General Hospital, where the privies were full of really sort of just interesting kinds of medical waste. You can think about all the sorts of things that might entail, so like bottles and other kinds of medical related objects like tools and so forth, but also part of an amputated human femur. So that's something that they pulled out of a privy, so you can imagine how that went down to the hospital. So there's also actually an exhibit with some of this material from the Toronto General Hospital associated with the Toronto International Film Festival, and ASI has a site up there, and I will put up a link to that page if anyone's curious. It gives you a little bit of information about that exhibit they have up. And I'm also going to link, I found it online rather, an excerpt from Dr. Holly Dr. Holly Martel's book, The Ward Uncovered, where she relates, in this particular anecdote, what happened when field crew from TMHC unexpectedly came across some large ordnance, so like a big shell that they thought might have been a bomb at the time, a historic one, while they were digging a privy deposit for the Armory Street dig, also in Toronto. So I'll link that as well, because I thought it was kind of a cool story and a neat example of some of the uncommon things that you might encounter in privies, and things that people have tossed in them over the years. Just some other examples. ASI also excavated several 19th century townhouses on Bishop's Block in Toronto, around Adelaide, and retrieved over 10,000 artifacts from one of the privies that was associated with this project. So we're actually lucky to have the collection from that project at the museum now, and some of the objects from that project are now part of our, have been used in our past artifact spotlights, and are now featured on our Google Arts and Culture page. They have come from that site. And one of the privies from that project was stone lined. As I was saying, there's different kinds of construction with the idea of trying to keep the waste in from contaminating the outside ground. And this particular privy had a lot of really interesting finds in it. So there were things like marbles and children's toys, including like full like children's tea sets, teaspoons, cutlery handles. There were writing slates, inkwells, oil lamp parts, just a mix of really sort of interesting household associated artifacts. And so this is, of course, in addition to all the broken ceramic tablewares and glasswares that also often find their way into these kinds of deposits. My friend at Stantec also told me about a beautiful molded Jackfield teapot that had a handle in the shape of, like it was molded, and there was this very elaborate with this handle in the shape of an eagle. It was broken into just a few parts that she really wanted to put back together, but didn't have a chance to. And if you don't know what Jackfield ware is, it's kind of a red earthenware, so like a fancy kind of terracotta that's been glazed in a really lustrous, rich black glaze. So it's just basically a really fancy teapot that somebody had tossed out. So both she and contact that I have at ARA, or Archaeological Research Associates, both brought up one of the other really cool things that you tend to get lots of in privy deposits, and that's archaeobotanical finds. So it was really when I was doing my talk on archaeobotany that I thought, well, hey, actually maybe privies would be a good topic on their own for this series. So I'm glad that they brought that up too. So this goes along with the sort of the good organic preservation that I talked about, but it's also kind of related to human digestion as well. So there are parts of plants that humans don't digest particularly well, like seeds, and since they don't get broken down, they got to pass through, and then they end up in the privy, right? So not only can seeds tell us about diets, they can give us information about seasonality, so we can get a sense of what season seasonal diets might have looked like. People were eating, for example, summer fruits like strawberries and raspberries. One of the example of finds that I was given from ARA is a project that they conducted on a privy associated with a black household in St. Catharines, where they found that people had in fact been eating strawberries and grapes and elderberries. So they were able to find this in the privy deposits and get that little bit of insight about the diet of the people who lived there. And again, because privies were sometimes used as a general waste disposal location, we also get other kinds of plant remains that I hope were not being eaten. So things like apple seeds. I mean, some people will eat your apple core, but peach bits, I hope people were not eating those or just sort of throwing them again into the privy as a general trash disposal. So we do get a lot of this sort of diet information from privies. And part of that, along with or other than just seed and plant remains, we also get a lot of faunal remains, so zoo archaeological materials. Again, because of that good organic preservation. So this is really, again, not so much an issue of digestion, but it goes back to this notion that people are using privies for disposing of general food waste as well as just human waste. Also, again, once privies had ceased to be used for their original purpose, they sometimes get converted into more of just sort of a trash dump where a lot of these kinds of remains could end up. And of course, faunal remains are another way that these features can help us reconstruct different diets and see comparative differences over time between other categorizations like socioeconomic class, ethnicity, race, and other cultural affiliations. So one of the examples or articles that I was reading in preparation for this talk from New England, one of the things that they found was that newer immigrants in their study area were less likely to obey these kinds of ordinances about how you could use privies and what you could dispose in them, compared to people whose families were more locally established. So not only the kinds of food remains, but whether or not you're finding them like mixed in with these can also provide information about more than just diet as well. So these things have lots of different things they can potentially tell us. And of course, not everything that we find in a privy has necessarily been put there deliberately. So human waste and other organic decay attracts all kinds of pests, as we know. So vermin, like insects, rats, and like microbes and parasites are things that we can find by examining privy wastes. So this is really interesting because a lot of insects, for example, have very specific ecological niches. They thrive in very specific conditions. They need certain kinds of things for food. They need certain environmental conditions like temperature and so forth, and other resources. And because of this, finding evidence of them in privy wastes can really help us reconstruct a lot of human living conditions by analogy. So it can tell us things about environmental change, things about seasonality, things about human food consumption, if there are pests that are generally associated with different kinds of foods. And they can, of course, even inform us about human health. So this not just insects, but privies can also contain evidence of parasites and other pathogens that affected past populations. So privy soils, like when they're excavated, often still contain parasite eggs. That's a delightful thought. Especially eggs from roundworms and whipworms. And so their presence can also be correlated with other kinds of similarly transmitted bacterial pathogens. So these are both pathogens that are associated with human fecal waste. And so if they're present, we can sort of say by analogy that it's possible that other kinds of fecal pathogens might have also been present in the population that were creating those deposits. So privy construction and maintenance over time were of course very related to health issues. As I said, 19th century peoples didn't really have the same grasp, didn't really have the same kind of understanding about disease that we do. So germ theory, really, so the idea that there are microscopic organisms that cause diseases, wasn't really starting, like it was around earlier, but it was really starting to get more traction, especially in public understanding, not until like the 1870s, 1880s, and even later. And then even, so in this period then, a significant amount of people thought diseases, again, were spread by this miasmas or bad air. Viruses, in fact, were only actually discovered in the 1890s, so they weren't something that, people had any concept of at the time. So because of this, people thought it was that bad smell or bad air from privies that were causing diseases. So they didn't understand things like it might be important to wash your hands necessarily. So it's not just about avoiding the smell, but there's other hygiene and sanitation issues that go along, or that privies can cause. So they didn't understand the significance of keeping like human waste in the yard and how that could spread parasites and other pathogens. So then as new sanitation infrastructure developed, including better water supply systems, and we also started seeing development of more sewers as well, and we started getting more considered construction and placement of privies, and eventually the introduction of running water, indoor bathrooms with flushing toilets, as well as new medical treatments. We start to see archaeologically the decrease of some of these parasites. So these changes, they don't occur evenly across populations even in the same area. And while I'm saying this, I should say a lot of the work that I was reading about, especially for this particular section of my talk, is really being done in the US. So a lot of it's coming out of New York and other parts of New England. So I'm not actually familiar with a lot of privy studies of this kind, looking at the parasites and so forth being done in Ontario. Although, I mean, I can't claim to have made a completely thorough investigation of all the literature in the past week. But it is interesting just to think about these different kinds of things we can learn, and just to have some general examples for you all about what we can learn about people and their past lives by looking at this special kind of feature. So I hope I've given you sort of an idea of why archaeologists might get so excited about having a chance to dig them up, and also how the archaeological approach and focus on understanding that broader context. So not just looking at like, here's some neat things we found in privies, but here's how we can take that knowledge and use it to understand the people who were using them, who were living in the area. So how this approach also is valuable in extracting what we can learn from privies. So thank you for joining us. Thursday we're going to have actually another talk from Dr. Neil Ferris, who's our Lawson Chair of Canadian Archaeology here at the museum. And he's going to be, again, connecting to some of the objects on our Google Arts and Culture page that come from his work at Mohawk Village. So next week, I think I'm going to focus my Tuesday talk on more of a history of archaeology, which is something else I've mentioned in the past. So just to sort of look at both how the practice has changed over time and also how archaeological thinking has changed as well, because it's not something that's static. So how archaeologists understand what they're doing and why they're doing it has changed over time. And I think that's important for people who are coming to a museum of archaeology to have some sense of. So as ever, if you have any questions or comments, or if you have any ideas for subjects you'd like us to try and cover, please just drop it in the comments. And I'm just going to go back now and leave some comments with those links that I promised you. So thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next week. And I hope you'll join us on Thursday.